We had a big range of topics to cover, and what we've decided to do is just, I guess, to focus on 4 of them. And it's actually a bit of a tag team here, so I'll be leading off and talking mainly about Phytophthora. Murray's going to talk about the virus issues last season, and Kev's going to finish off with the Ascochyta and a bit of a general summary. Doesn't seem to be working. Anyway. Okay, I'll just, a very quick overview of what happened in 2012, and later on I'll talk about why those particular things happened. So we had some herbicide issues, particularly down here, June, July through to September. Then in July we had some waterlogging and some Phytophthora outbreaks, and some that were quite severe. From mid-July onwards, we had dry, cold and frosty weather. So I'm not going to talk about seed discoloration in this talk, but there were some big issues in central Queensland with seed discoloration, and it was really to do with those drought conditions and also probably the frost as well. And some varieties were a lot more affected than others. Ascochyta in general last year was very rare. In the surveys that Kevin did, he found it in just a handful of crops. So the season really wasn't conducive to Ascochyta, except in CQ. There were 5 or 6 rainfall events in July, and there were big outbreaks of Ascochyta throughout central Queensland, in places where Ascochyta hadn't been found before. And luckily the season dried out, and it wasn't an issue after that, but it could have been quite a big issue because all the varieties grown in central Queensland are susceptible. There were some salt issues in September in some crops, and once again some quite severe. And Murray's going to talk about the virus issues that happened in October. Okay, we'll just have a look at the rainfall for Goondiwindi, and I guess this rainfall pattern explains some of the outbreaks that we had. So we had a good early profile in January, pretty normal rainfall or a little bit below average for the rest of the season. Some good rainfall in July, but then from then on it was dry. So it was one of those years. Well, I'll just talk about Phytophthora first. So this is PBA boundary. On the 2nd of August, Kevin went to visit this paddock and there was an outbreak of Phytophthora, and that's actually in the upper end of the paddock. And if you notice the silos there, anyway, you can see the silos in the background there, and the next shot shows what happens. By the end of August, it was basically a wipeout, that paddock. So, and you can see the silos in the distance. Now that particular paddock that had Phytophthora, it had a long history of grassland and also native medics, wild medics. And as the Phytophthora that attacks chickpeas is also able to attack medics and lucerne as well. So the paddock on the right had a long history of cultivation. There was no medic in that paddock. So it just shows you the difference. Same variety. Sorry? Same variety. It was the same variety? Yeah, same variety. Yep. Okay, and what I'll just talk about now briefly is, for the last 3 or 4 years we've conducted some what we call yield loss trials to do with Phytophthora. They're conducted here and at Tamworth, and we're collaborating very closely with Kevin and his group, and in fact his technician produces tens of thousands of plates that we can inoculate these trials with, which would take a very long time. So these trials are inoculated. We're looking at a range of varieties, and we're also looking at some newer material, and we control the disease by putting on a fungicide called Ridamil. So it's only active against Phytophthora. And basically we look at the difference in yield between the sprayed and the unsprayed plots, or the treated and the untreated plots. So this just shows you on the left, you can see hat trick. So, you know, there's probably 20% of plants in there that have got Phytophthora. This new series of hybrids that are coming out, so they're crosses between normal chickpea varieties and a wild Sisa species. So it's a wild chickpea. And it just shows you the difference. They're both untreated plots. So you can just see the difference in resistance, and it really bodes well for the future, some of these varieties. Okay, so this table, or this graph, shows the yield losses from those trials. The ones on the left in green, they're all those hybrid lines. You can see really good resistance. We see Yorker. It has the best levels of resistance of Phytophthora of all the commercial varieties. We've got hat trick. So hat trick's very similar to Jimbor. But have a look at Boundary. It's the most susceptible variety that we've got. And this has been consistent over the 2 or 3 years that we've checked or worked with Boundary. So what do we do about management for Phytophthora? Well, once the crop's in the ground, there's nothing you can do. Infected plants are just going to die, and they can die from emergence right through to, you know, post-flowering. So it's really about avoiding poorly drained paddocks. So the Phytophthora loves wet soil. That's how it infects. You know, the spores need to actually swim through the wet soil to the roots. So avoid those sort of areas. Avoid paddocks where there's been a history of medics. As I said, Yorker's got better resistance than hat trick. Hat trick's similar to Jimbor, but it's better than Kyabra. And Boundary is the worst. So if you suspect, if you've had a history of Phytophthora in your paddock, or you suspect that it might be at high risk, such as a low-lying area, don't grow Boundary. And I'll just talk quickly about salt. There were some salt issues this year, not only in northern New South Wales, but also in some of the areas of Western Queensland. Oh, sorry, the Western Downs. And really that was all to do with, I guess, the rainfall we had in 2010, 2011 raised the soil moisture profile. It also brought salts up. And the dry weather we had in August, September onwards, the roots had to grow down further just to survive. So they hit that salt layer in those particular areas. And this graph just shows the sensitivity to salinity. So we have chickpea, the most sensitive field crop that we've got, compared with crops like barley that are far less sensitive. So I guess the take-home message there really is, 1, get a soil test, and 2, if you suspect you've got a problem with salinity, don't grow chickpeas. And I just put this last slide up. In Queensland, they estimate probably about 3 million hectares are at risk from salinity in the future, so it's going to be one of those things that may show up in the future, particularly if some of these areas are widely grown to susceptible crops. I might leave it there, and it's Murray's turn to talk about the virus issues.
Okay, thanks, Mal. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about what happened last year with the virus outbreaks in chickpeas, and then I guess what what the best recommendations are at this stage. So this was a photo of a chickpea crop that was badly affected by viruses late spring last year in October. There was about 40% of the plants were symptomatic and dying in that crop, and also about 10 to 20% of the non-symptomatic plants were also infected at that stage. So they were likely then to develop severe symptoms within a couple of weeks. So here is a problem situation where there was low plant density. You can see bare dirt patches and also a low stubble load. And I'll talk a bit about why that's a risk a little bit later on. Essentially, chickpeas can be affected by upwards of 12 different viruses. But the vast majority of the viruses that affect chickpeas are aphid transmitted. They're in the what we call the ludiovirus group. So yeah, they're carried in by aphids. And also another important point is that almost certainly chickpeas don't act as a source to themselves. So the viruses aren't moving within the chickpea crop. It's not acting as one plant acting as a source to the next plant. All the virus which is coming into the chickpea crops are coming from an outside source with aphids. And so this data is from Andrew Varel, and it's showing the relationship between the incidence of plant virus and the plant density, and just shows the risk of having lower plant densities. So on the y-axis we've got 0 to 100% virus incidence per square metre, and then the plant density, so going from 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 and 45 plants per square metre. So clearly once you get below about 20 plants per square metre, you've got a significant increase in virus incidence. So that's why a strong recommendation is to make sure the plant densities are up 25 plus plants per square metre to reduce that risk. Another thing we observed last year was an association between brassica crops, canola and mustard crops growing next to chickpea crops or in close vicinity to them. So virus incidence in the canola or mustard seed crops was very high. I think in this case it was, this case was 30 out of 30 of the chickpeas had beet western yellows virus, but also the canola crops were very high incidence of virus. And you can see a strong edge effect here where there's a lot of virus affected plants and then gradually dropping off further into the crop. So we know that these canola and mustard crops are a really good host or a common host for virus, and also a pretty good host for aphids, which then move out of those. If you don't have canola crops, you've got to also be aware of the other brassica weeds like turnip weed and wild mustard, which are very common along fence lines and fallow paddocks. These act as a source of virus and aphids. You can see chickpea crops being affected here with virus, and also evidence of very high aphid populations with the mummified aphids on the turnip weed. So what are the recommendations? Well, unfortunately, in-crop control of aphids is not effective. Kevin's shown pretty clearly that in-crop sprays for aphids don't control virus incidence. And once chickpea plants are infected with virus, they generally die. So best management is cultural practices. So making sure that you've got, essentially there's three things: making sure you've got a healthy crop, reducing the attractiveness of that crop to aphids, and also reducing the source of virus around the crop which might be coming in. So one of those strategies is to have standing stubble, which has been shown in a range of other crops to be a deterrent to aphids landing and feeding in a crop. So it's a reflective mulch essentially. The aphids are distracted by it and move on. So that's a beneficial thing to try and aim for. As I said before, uniformity and high plant density, so above 25 plants per square metre. Make sure that the canopy is even and closes over quickly so that there's no bare dirt, which is also attractive to aphids. As I said, healthy crop, effective inoculation of the seed prior to planting it, and good nutrition. And control of weeds, like crop hygiene, so making sure that there's a limited number of those weeds which we know are a host for the virus and the aphids, and also considering that it's worth considering that canola or mustard crops may be a risk factor close to chickpea crops. So the next couple of slides are really just, I guess, examples of best practice. So clearly there's good even plant densities which are going to quickly close over, planted into standing stubble, and with good control of broadleaf weeds. And then last year in this general region, in the Edgeroy region, there were several crops which were severely affected by virus, which had in the order of 40 to 50% severe plant infections. This crop was grown nearby, but was planted at a good density and into standing stubble, and also with wheat stubble below. And there was only about 3% virus infection. It was almost certainly subjected to the same disease pressure as those other crops, but something about the good management of that crop meant that the virus levels were much lower. And also, I guess what I should mention, which I haven't, is that in addition to canola being a risk factor, also lucerne is known to be a very common host to certain aphid-transmitted viruses, which also affect chickpeas. So be aware that that's also a risk factor planting close to lucerne crops. That's about all I've got to say for chickpea viruses.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. While I'm getting wired here, Mel mentioned the surveys I did last year, and of the 363 crops that I looked at in northern New South Wales, I found Ascochyta in only 10, and only 1 was north of Coonamble. So the question to you, ladies and gentlemen, is Ascochyta was very uncommon last year. What do you think that means for this year? Are we looking at we don't need to worry about it this year? Don't worry about spraying Kyabra or Jimbor? Remember what happened in 2009? Not a particularly favourable year for Ascochyta. 2010, it really got going early in the season. So the take-home message from that is, even though our levels of inoculum going into this year's chickpea season will be low, if you're growing a susceptible variety and conditions are favourable, it can build up very, very quickly. On things like Kyabra and Jimbor, from the time of infection to the time you get those little black fruiting bodies appearing on the plants is 7 days. So it's got quite a rapid turnaround time. Volunteer chickpeas on the Varietal to North Star Road yesterday. The paddock's been sprayed out. This plant happens not to have Ascochyta, but if it did, is this a threat to this year's chickpea crop? It's dead, the plant's dying. Why is it a threat, Gav McDowell? But it's been killed. Exactly. Just because you've killed the plant with Ascochyta, it can grow on dead tissue. So the greatest risk to your chickpea crops this year from Ascochyta is complacency. Now, you people can manage Ascochyta. You've been doing that very successfully for many years. And these couple of slides, this slide here just shows that we can control Ascochyta quite well in susceptible variety like Jimbor or Kyabra. So this is our trial in 2011. We couldn't get Ascochyta at Tamworth last year. We've got very susceptible variety Jimbor, sprayed 6 times with the fungicide you people use to control Ascochyta in your crops, and Hat-Trick, which has got useful resistance. If we don't spray Jimbor at all, or we get our timing wrong, this is what we end up with in a season that was moderately conducive to Ascochyta. So we've moved from highly susceptible variety through to varieties like PBA Hat-Trick, PBA Boundary that have very useful resistance to Ascochyta, to the extent that you probably only have to spray these newer varieties a few times. But how do you know you've got Hat-Trick? In 2010 at Narromine and 2011 at Mungandai, I was shown chickpea crops that the grower believed was Hat-Trick. But the Ascochyta was suggesting that it wasn't Hat-Trick. Now, that last year we developed a DNA tool that enables us to identify the 24 most commonly grown chickpeas in Eastern Australia and advanced breeding material. And we used those molecular markers on 36 seed lots from the 2011 crop, so in Queensland, so Queensland chickpea growers that delivered chickpeas to GrainCorp from the 2011 crop. We got 36 samples. From each sample we grew 8 plants. From each of those 8 plants we extracted the DNA and challenged those with the molecular markers. Only 15 of those 36 samples were all 8 plants the same. All right, so more than half of them were mixtures. One of them wasn't even what the grower delivered it as. So what does this mean for you people? Well, as I said, if you're growing hat trick, and it's all hat trick, then in a year that's conducive to Ascochyta, you're probably up from maximum 2 sprays, which at $15 a hectare is $30. If you're growing Jimbo or Kyabra in a year, say like 2008, you're probably looking at about 6 sprays. And that's worth $90 an acre, a hectare. So for every 100 hectares, you're looking at a $6,000 difference. Now, if you are unsure of the authenticity of your variety, what are you going to do? How are you going to manage the crop? You have to manage it if it was susceptible, because you can't, these plants will be scattered throughout the crop if it's a mixture, so you're going to treat the whole paddock as if it was susceptible. So that's going to add $6,000 for every 100 hectares of chickpeas you're growing if the variety isn't what you think it is. So however you might acquire your chickpea seed, make sure you've got a pretty good idea of what it is. So our take-home messages for this season, and this applies to any crop, you should start with good quality seed that at least you know the germination of, and preferably the vigour, and treat it with the registered fungicide. The registered fungicides in chickpeas not only control seed-borne Ascochyta and seed-borne botrytis, they also protect the seedlings from soil-borne diseases. Mel's covered the Phytophthora quite well. If you suspect you've got a salinity problem or paddocks where the best crop is barley, you want to think carefully about getting a soil test. And if your electrical conductivity is greater than 1.5 decisiemens per metre, do not plant chickpeas in that paddock. Murray's handled the virus, and finally, just be aware of Ascochyta. We don't know what this season's going to bring in terms of Ascochyta, but if you're growing a susceptible variety and we get many rainfall events, it will show up because it's endemic in the region.
Might be asking the wrong people, but just wondered if anyone wanted to comment on what we can expect with future chickpea varieties.
The bar next to Yorker was a line called CISA, that's Coordinated Improvement of Chickpea in Australia, 0912. That's your next horse. It has excellent Ascochyta resistance, Phytophthora resistance as good as or slightly better than Yorker. It's got good resistance to Pratelenchus thornii, and by resistance to Pratelenchus thornii I mean the nematode doesn't increase as much on 912 as it does on, say, Kyabra. And at the Taluna NVT site in 2010, 912 stood up better to botrytis grey mould than any other entry. So that's what's coming along, Brad. And Christy Hobson tells me that she's got something like 80 genotypes in her program that are better than hat trick in terms of the disease package, yield and quality. So it's, yeah, I think your money through the endpoint royalties and through your GRDC levy, we'd like to think it's been wisely invested in terms of developing improved chickpea varieties.
How far away is 912?
It's ready to go once we've got, is it 500 tonnes?
Yeah.
I think they've got the marketing partner, and we don't know who that is at the moment, but it's probably going to be SeedNet. I don't think they'll release it until they've got 500 tonne. So a chickpea plant has a multiplication rate of, say, 50. So one seed will produce 50 seeds, so you can work it out. 20 grams per 100 seeds, you do the maths.
912, still as susceptible to virus as our existing lines?
Yeah, I think so, Red Dog. Job van Leur and Christy had a chickpea virus nursery at Breezer last year where they had, I think, all the advanced breeding material and all the current varieties. Beat Western Yellow's got in there and towed up the lot of them. They all died. So, but I mean, Bird Western Yellows is only one of the viruses. It happened to be the most important virus last year, but I've been to properties where the virus, the suite of viruses varies from paddock to paddock on the same farm, in the same variety. So it's very dynamic. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, question for Mal. Have you guys played around with any phos acid type brews for Phytophthora, which obviously used a lot in horticulture?
Yeah, we did some trials back in the 80s, and we also did some work with metalaxyl as a seed dressing. I mean, as you know, it's registered, but very expensive to use, and only lasts about 3 or 4 weeks. The issue with phosphorus acid is that we had to spray it fairly regularly, and we did some residue analysis, and most of it actually stays up in the foliage, probably 75%, and only 25% gets down, and as it goes on, it gets diluted. So I don't think it's really an option.
Yeah, Kevin and Mal, the canola obviously area is going to increase yet again. It's sort of doubled every year for the last 4 or 5 years in the north. Just as a bit of a play around last year, I put 20 hectares of chickpeas in following canola in 2011, and I didn't see any evidence of virus or any disease issues there. Obviously weed control, I used turbines, seemed to control the clearfield canola all right. One thing we see with canola is obviously breaks the soil up, and there's some advantage there with maybe weed control and disease control. Are you seeing what you're saying there about virus not being, you know, necessarily a bit hard to pick where it is? I'm wondering if my canola sucked all of aphids into the canola and they left the chickpeas alone.
I'd be surprised if that happened. Normally the aphids would probably build up in the canola to a point where what appeared to happen last year was it was either canola or the other brassica weeds like turnip weed or wild mustard, where because of that dry period for several months, those weeds and crops were drying down and the aphids were leaving en masse. They were growing wings and taking to the air. I guess one point I didn't make clear is that the viruses have to survive in living plant material. So having a canola crop followed by chickpea crop's not necessarily any risk to the chickpea crop unless you've got volunteer canola plants which are surviving across the season. So yeah, it's not a soil-borne disease. And also the virus generally doesn't affect canola very much, particularly if it's a late infection, so you may not see much in the way of symptoms in canola. It's just a very good host for the virus.
I suppose the other thing is spraying phosphorus in the canola, because that's the canola crop, right?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, that's a question that someone brought up at morning tea about, you know, trying to reduce the source of virus moving into chickpeas. Well, if that means possibly if you knew you had a very high population of aphids in your canola and you're worried about them taking flight and moving into chickpeas, well, there may be some advantage in spraying them out, but I can't make a recommendation on that because there's really no data.